Thank you so much. All right, so again, thank you, Donnell, and thank you to Dell and Jordan for carrying on this line of inquiry from a very invigorating workshop series last year. And thank you to Maura and the CAS for their conference holding virtuosity. And let me begin. I also want to say I'm going to try and promise a quiet foray into Rome and Asia Minor, which is brought to life for us by this vista from Hierapolis in Phrygia. My home office is above a busy stretch of Flatbush in Brooklyn, so I can't make guarantees. Okay, so last term, my contribution to the workshop focused on epigraphic, legal, and literary sources for the civic actors and social status of a group I called and continue to call lettered laborers. So these are doctors and educators who enjoyed privileges on local, imperial, and ad hoc levels, brought to life by these Vespasianic and reinscribed triumviral edicts. These are exemptions from billeting and taxation, and these figures, I argued, are notable for a discussion on labor insofar as they construed an interface between social strata and the pursuit of occupations, either for fun or for money. In the case of doctors, the interface lay between elite polymath dabblers in medicine and those who were remunerated. And for teachers, educated grammarians who worked with elite youths and yet themselves were of a variety of labor statuses. So I suggested some modes for considering professional solidarity among doctors and teachers. As a professional group, their membership included people who did not need to work for money, but who also existed within the same civic bounds of recognition. Today, I'm keeping up with the theme of professional groups in the Roman East. My title is meant to evoke the lexicon of values associated with civic munificence. It is, for the most part, on the pre-mortem side of the trifecta considered in the panel's title. The vocabulary of such munificence, though, furnishes a starting point to consider the connection between civic benefactions and associations of laborers. Association here is shorthand for voluntary associations arranged by occupation, known as collegia in the Latin West, and for that matter, as collegion in a couple of instances from Asia Minor. I'm trying to confine myself here to the synodoi, ergasiae, and synergasiae extant in Asia Minor, extant from Asia Minor, in part because I want to put associations in conversance with euergetism, euergetism being the scholarly neologism, the obligatory system of aristocratic munificence that allowed urban life in the eastern provinces both to run on a quotidian level and to thrive on a cultural level. Inscriptions from Lydia and Phrygia and Asia Minor are particularly chatty when it comes to the activities of textile associations. So we'll see evidence from that today. And actually, here's an example to situate us. So in the Phrygian city of Hierapolis, known in antiquity and today for its hot springs, a person called Tiberius Claudius Zotikos Boas took on a number of local offices. For his dispatching of these roles, he was recognized in two inscriptions. The most august guild of purple dyers, Ergasia Porphyrobaphon, it begins, raised a statue of Tiberius Claudius Zotikos Boas, first strategos and honor-loving Aganothete and secretary of the temples of the imperial cult of the province of Asia, an outstanding ambassador and high priest, benefactor of his fatherland. A second inscription, this time in English, repeats the same career highlights, except this was offered by the local guild of wool washers, Ergasia ton Areoploton, and gives the names of the people tasked with raising the statue, seemingly fairly recent citizens. The nature of the relationship between Zotikos and the wool washers and purple dyers is not elucidated, but the affirmation by these guilds indicates a notable instance of civic discourse across socioeconomic bounds, manual laborers as the arbiters of civic honors. It is precisely this relationship that I will foreground today through a consideration of the following questions. On the one hand, the elite professionals of the lettered variety elevate their chosen vocation through honorific. How did this happen? Sorry, this is the question. How did elite professionals of the lettered variety elevate their chosen vocation through honorific language? How and cui bono did associations of laborers participate in and affirm through honorific language the public-facing activities of individuals? So for background to these questions, which attempt to locate the laborer as a euergetic agent, I begin with an overview of the laborer within the variegated world of imperial Greek literature, which Jane Sansonito compellingly elucidated yesterday as she dispelled the monolithic attitude projected by the most commonly cited sources that we use when it comes to approaching labor. Here I aim to briefly incorporate the perceptions of labor by authors who concurrently have a concern with the civic makeup of the Greek city. So in the Roman East, which was dotted with cities that to varying degrees had flashy cultural activities that esteemed sophistic demonstration, agonism of all stripes, and polymathy of all varieties, if one had to work, what should one pursue? Extant texts from proponents of and participants in the competitive learned environments, such as Plutarch and Galen, espouse views on work that are predictably founded upon a distaste for manual labor, although both notably had an interest in promoting medicine up the occupational ladder into the realm of acceptable otium fillers. But a handful of other sources provide attitudes towards work that range from the helpfully accepting to the fulsomely approbative, and all come from authors who express similar concerns about one's civic participation in the city. The Bithynian sophist, orator, cum philosopher Dio Chrysostom promises, towards the end of his lengthy Euboean oration, a fantastical rendering of a visit he supposedly took to a desolated version of Euboea, to answer the very question of the right kind of employment. And he may have done that, but the oration as it comes down to us only includes the bad types of jobs, from the comic actor to the brothel owner, before it breaks off. We can extrapolate from this section of the oration the attributes of good jobs in Dio's eyes. They do not contribute to any depravity of soul or body, and they provide consistent work and a living to those who perform them zealously and industriously. In exchange, the job holder will, to his or her credit, always have work and livelihood. Dio also offers examples of types of acceptable work by way of his advice to working class people to ignore the occupational critiques directed at them individually or at their parents, since there's no shame in being the child of a servant, grape harvester, or of someone who wet nursed for pay, who taught letters or taught children. For Dio, the quality of the paid work was subject to moral critiques, but the general status was not. A similarly open approach towards labor was aired by the 2nd century wag Lucian, who self-reported in his Somnium that when he reached adolescence, he was the subject of a discussion between his father and his father's buddies, who considered all manners of crafts among teenaged Lucian's next moves. Their consideration, Lucian tells us, were based on which of the trades was best, which was easiest to learn, which was suitable for a man of free birth, which needed equipment that you could easily get, and offered an income that was sufficient. Lucian's quick rejection of the sculpting track that won out had more to do with the prestigious and literal allure of Paideia as she appeared to him in a dream than with any outright dismissal of an income. But his lettered career choice is indicative of the elite mentality towards vocations. So in Galen's Protreptikos, the Pergamene doctor envisioned practitioners of the arts broadly configured in rings around the god, their distance from the god relational to the prestige. The contemporary-ish philosopher Maximus of Tyre, we know scraps about his exact lifespan, employed in his 15th dialexis or oration a different metaphor for the variety of occupations in any given city, mapping them on to the human body. Whether a builder, weaver, carpenter, smith, chef, or entertainer, one might say that no one comes into life without a contribution to make. Then this man is something of practical utility to offer, that man some craft or skill, that other some source of enjoyment. A city inhabited by such people is like the human body, which is composed of many parts of many different kinds and is kept together by the collaboration of the parts in the service of the whole. For the purposes of civic functioning, that is, worker collaboration coupled with recognition of individual skills were of paramount importance. Finally, and as Jane also mentioned yesterday, any anti-work sentiment was conspicuously absent from Artemidorus's Onirocritica, a 2nd century dream book, which has often been used for insight into the subaltern quotidian concerns in the imperial East. Throughout, Artemidorus does not offer much in the way of career advice, but he tends not to condemn any paid occupation on moral grounds. Indeed, dreams about descents to hell, as we find in 2.1, are bad not for nightmarish reasons, but instead because to dream of going down into Hades and seeing all that is traditionally said to be there signifies inactivity and harm for successful people who live a life of their own choosing. The qualifier of their own choosing allows us to theorize about the lived work experiences of people for whom work is necessary, but for whom some range of choice existed. The fact that Dio Chrysostom, Lucian, and Artemidorus mention choice indicates, for instance, that family precedent was not the primary determinant of occupation, which is a common assumption about medical education or various crafts as being family businesses, family affairs. But Galen, who is avowedly not a physician for hire, reports a sort of vocational awakening by proxy that happened to him as a youth. On Prognosis, he reports that a philosophically minded patient, Eudemus, heard that when my father, his name is Nikon, was introducing me to philosophy, he had been commanded by unambiguous dreams to educate me thoroughly in medicine, not just as a hobby. Nikon's distinct dreams were what led him to switch Galen's vocation from philosopher to doctor, but not only as a par ergon or hobby, secondary occupation. It was not the money to be had from doctoring that led Galen's land-rich architect father to make this unilateral decision. And as a result, Galen's assiduous output over the course of his career, despite not making money from doing it, make it difficult to speak about him as anything other than a doctor. For certain professions, then, it is difficult to assess from afar whether one is looking at a professional, an unpaid elite expert, or an armchair par ergon enthusiast. But those professions are assuredly not wool washers or dyers. For insight into those fields, we need to incorporate the epigraphic evidence. So amid this backdrop, that is an elite literary outlook, commenting on the lived professional experiences of denizens in Hellenophone cities, I want to return to the affirmation offered to individual elites by groups of workers. I invoke our titular Phil word, that of philotemia, love of honor. Ramsay MacMullen characterized the word as one that surpassed none in its ability, quote, to explain the Greco-Roman achievement and decried the lack of a scholarly treatise on it. There's now a 2012 collected volume that explores it nominally in Plutarch, but throughout other imperial Greek authors as well. For Peter Brown, it was the defining trait of the Antonine age, a shorthand for the, quote, blatant competitiveness on all levels of social life. It's absent as an explicit ideal from the most storied fount of heroic values, Homer. Philotemia's innately ambiguous quality, that is, whose love, whose honor, were defanged when incorporated into the Athenian laudatory stock and trade of 4th century oratory and civic honorifics, to borrow the phrasing of David Whitehead, who wrote about it in a 1983 article and then in his book on the Demes of Attica. So if benefactors wanted to put their philotemia to work for the demosia rather than for the idios, Athenians were on board with reaping the profits therein. The phrasing survived and disseminated throughout the Hellenistic and imperial periods, albeit now without quite as much of a fear that individual benefactors could do anything with their largesse other than prestige garnering. So over time, philotemia came to be a synonym for euergesia, or benefactions. One explicit example can be found in one of the 3 relatively recently discovered letters from Alexandria Troas that Hadrian sent to the Synod of the Dionysian Technitai, or performers, who are a very well-documented labor group as well. So Hadrian affirmed that the director of local contests did not have the right to avoid the philotemia of providing a banquet to their performers. I use the word to symbolize the euergetic superstructure of civic life in the Roman East. Here I make 2 suggestions about the linkage of philotemia and labor in Imperial Asia Minor. First, philotemia as a motivating factor was a strategy invoked by elite workers as a mode of differentiating their work from that of remunerated people. Secondly, as I mentioned at the top of this talk, philotemia was a component of the euergetic recognition of benefactors by labor associations. I suggest that one of the mutually beneficial angles that has not yet been explored, so that's what I plan to do, is the mode in which recognition of philotemia by a labor association could be emphasized by the benefactor in order to get out of less desirable and costlier civic obligations. This is a recurrent sticking point for wealthy celebrities, such as Aelius Aristides, who are skittish about becoming overburdened by obligations and willing to phone in any sort of favors to get out of them. To the first point, which is in its nascence, and I anticipate that there are further epigraphic examples, but I have not yet had time to find them. Philotemia as a way of presenting work as a public benefaction. I offer an example that actually connects back to Galen's architect dad, Aelius Nikon. So he is associated with a small group of isopstephic inscriptions from Pergamon. Isopsophisms are mathematical texts in which the numerical value of each letter is totaled, and the sum of certain words or lines is equal throughout the poem or whatever format, and used to highlight meaningful connections, and seemingly above all in this setting, to highlight the playful erudition of the inscriber. Among the people who contributed to this microcorpus of texts from Pergamon were Aelius Nikon, the architect, and another architect named Julius Nicodemus, also known as New Nikon. Nicodemus, likely a protege of Nikon, paid homage to his teacher both by employing his name and by composing this dedication of a portico he completed in Pergamon. Architect, which totals 2,186, as indicated on this tabula ansata inscription. Architect to the gods, ever sacred artisans, I, Nicodemus the Good, and at the same time the young Nikon, 2,186, entirely secured and adorned the colonnaded office of the agronomos with his own love of honor. In life, only one goal is noble, beneficence, 2,186. Architects, like doctors, were of varying social status in the Greek East, and both, as Claire Holleran demonstrated yesterday, got around. It's uncommon for anyone's name to be associated with a building, except for the person who sponsored it. So Nicodemus is here represented as a divine craftsman, motivated purely by the euergetic values of philotomia and eupoeia. These are, incidentally, as Galen reports elsewhere in his corpus, what should be, in his opinion, the outcome of every area of study. And he reports that he inherited such a view from his father. He claims at one point in his corpus, he tells the anecdote that his fellow students attributed Galen's superior intellect, visible even as a student, to his father's public interests. Because of your father's philotomia, they said, you have made use of your surpassing nature and an excellent education. And elsewhere, Galen makes the claim that the outcome of any intensive study ought to be euergesia, which is literal do-gooding. In both medicine and architecture, then, the proffering of one's services as a gesture of philotomia is what elevated the activity from work to ministration. Philotomia was at the root of the vocation for people of Galen's ilk and what distinguished it above all from paid labor. But in Imperial Asia Minor, particularly during the height of euergetic giving in the 2nd century CE, anything could be and was done philotemos, or generously, ambitiously, and importantly for positions for which were voluntarily obligatory, willingly. So given the frequency of philotomia and its variance in honorific inscriptions, it is not surprising to see it in inscriptions of the kind I mentioned before, honors offered by labor associations towards individuals. In addition to the purple dyers and wool washers of Hierapolis, similar honorific recognition was proffered towards individuals by guilds of dyers. And here we're going to Thyatira and Lydia. So dyers, such as this example, and to bakers to a guy who adorned, a guy who's an agnothetes and also held a number of other positions, who adorned the city with his lineage, his deeds, and his love of honor all the time and was a founder of the city. Another example was to leather cutters, to a man who, among other things, was a priest to Artemis in a pious and honor-loving manner. So these groups, these dyers, bakers, leather cutters, are employing the same moral lexicon as civic decrees had for generations, to use John Kloppenborg's phrasing. The dyers, for instance, you don't have to read all of that, honored Marcus, who was a philotemon man who performed liturgies for his city, served as a supervisor of the ergon of the dyers often, and dispatched other functions as an agronomos and purchaser of grain and builder in his community. Here we see a relationship between the association and the honorand in a way that is elsewhere elusive. So Philip Harland has read his position as related to the ergon of the dyers, the building of the dyers, as a reference not to an internal position within the guild. That is, he's not a member of the guild quad dyer. He sees someone like this Marcus as an external benefactor tending to the dyer's building. So other honorifics from associations to individuals, as I said, lack such clear links for the cause of the commemoration. But even without the connection between Marcus and the dyers, his contributions to Thyatira's civic life are manifold and self-evident. So this free-flowing philotomia and eunoia, commented on with approbation by the dyers, leather cutters, and wool washers of Lydia and throughout Asia Minor, were part of a rather calculated euergetic exchange. If one had money, one was expected to spend it on the city in a fluid philopatris gesture. The associations recognizing benefactors in these regions were assuredly receiving something in terms of material gains beyond the social capital, which is also very important, to be had from public alignment between labor group and upright citizen. Associations of workers, after all, replicated civic structures both in their internal organization and their external advertising throughout the empire, not just in Asia Minor, as a lot of recent work has shown. And epigraphic recognition affirmed the benefactor in a demonstrable manner, while associations gleaned that social capital to be expended in varying modes. So the symbiotic benefits of benefaction recognition are well established, and increasingly the forces of competition and exclusion are recognized, thanks in part to the work of Jinyu Liu, who emphasizes this over the narrative of integration into the system of elite urban values as the motivating factor by which the association sought support. So something that has been on my mind and mostly only exists there as of now in a nascent form is the idea of whether an additional benefit is to be had by the benefactors recognized in these inscriptions, whether it could protect them from being forced or cajoled into future obligations. Perhaps the public recognition in civic strains of a benefactor's private largesse towards an association of workers provided said benefactors with a demonstrable portfolio of philotimia, such that he could recuse himself from more exacting euergetic obligations. That this was a concern is clear from Aelius Aristides' fourth Hieros Logos, in which he self-reports trying to get out of a series of civic posts, ranging from the high priesthood of Asia, to a priesthood of Asclepios, to a tax collector, to the chief of police. So far in the inscriptions I've laid eyes on, the people recognized, as in the examples above from the Dyers et al., seem to have been those sorts of positions, those people seem to have held those sorts of positions already inbuilt into the cursus that the associations report, which would indicate that the people being affirmed euergetically by such associations weren't shying away from their euergetic obligations in the way Aristides attempted to do in repeatedly having his exemptions upheld. But two additional examples make me want to pursue this line of thinking further. The first is away from Asia Minor, taking us to Philadelphia in the Fayum in Egypt. So a petition, P. Phil 10 from 139 CE records a request from a group of 12 weavers asking that 4 among them be exempted from their public duties so that they can fulfill a public order of clothing. So Jinyu Liu has adduced this as evidence for the weavers' organizational prowess in protecting members from having to serve additional liturgies. And thus they would be freed up to spend more time doing weaving. And in this case, and spending time on their public orders, which is also a way of shutting out other people who might have taken up those orders. So exemptions, it was understood between the elite and the sub-elite, were freeing in terms of time, money, and labor. The second example comes from a well-known letter to Smyrna, in which Septimius Severus and Caracalla affirmed the exemption of the sophist Claudius Rufinus. The sophists, the emperor's claim, was called to act as strategos despite having an exemption. Having fulfilled it out of his love for his country, he nevertheless should be left alone from additional liturgies, lest his philotemia become a penalty, or zemia. The implication is that those who have sought exemptions ought to be allowed to give where they want to give, and cities ought to take what they can get from these benefactors, be that wealth, education, or generalized greatness, lest the benefactor's philotemia turns sour. Personal connections are, and were, everything. And I wonder if, in addition to looking upwards to the connections that people like Rufinus could rely upon from imperial sources and wiggling out of liturgies, we might also be able to look downwards and find evidence for modes by which the Rufinii of the world could use financial largesse extended towards labor organizations as demonstrations of extra liturgical benefactions. So turning now to something kind of different as a coda or bonus, I want to offer a brief aside on another Phil word relating to work and standard fare in epigraphic documentation. When I started to research my contribution to the workshop, I recalled an inscription from Koroneia in central Greece, again, not in Asia Minor, also not Roman, from the mid-second century BCE. It's a proximity decree. I promise there is writing on that stone, I think. It was republished in 2007 by Albert Schachter and William Slater for one of a number of poeti vaganti, another group of mobile professionals to adduce to clerics, doctors, and architects. They're fairly common in the Hellenistic world, and this poet, Zotion, came from Ephesus and wrote tragedies and satyr plays. His performance at Koroneia earned him praise for presenting his own poetry and for composing, seemingly, poetry in a celebration of Koroneia and their patron deity, perhaps at a festival to Athena. Like in other Hellenistic inscriptions for visiting people, it is his industry and his conduct in general that merited this special plaudit, his Philoponia and his Anastrophe. Why this came to mind is for the very reason that it reminded me that a word exists in Greek that lays out quite literally a value judgment about work, Philoponia, love of work. So a search of its occurrences on Pacem indicates its efflorescence in the 2nd century BCE, which is also the peak time for long and descriptive civic decrees as common currency of intracity relationship building. Philoponia, then, is an infrequent but occasional enough presence in epigraphic documentation from the 3rd century BCE to late antiquity, whose epigraphic representation is never connected to physical labor unless it is athletically construed. So in that record, it exists as a synonym and corollary of another frequently vaunted quality, that of spude or zeal. So the Hellenistic uses of the adjective and noun confined to Asia Minor, so not considering the evidence from elsewhere, when it's applied to people whose specific role is being celebrated in an urban setting, it's used most often for foreign judges, ambassadors, and people holding positions related to maintenance of the gymnasium, indicating the word's valence within the realm of social education. Philoponia was, for instance, a contest mentioned in the 2nd century BCE gymnasiarchal law of Beroia. So the intellectual valences dovetailed with the zealous tendency towards selfless do-gooding expected in Hellenistic and Roman cities. In the textual record, the word is more expansive. I'm sure many of you could offer examples of. Philoponos or Philoponia could be applied variously to the practitioners or output of soldiers, hunting dogs, philosophers, silver miners, historical writers, students, and hunters. A primarily physical dimension associated with Philoponia was subsumed over time into a generalized sense of industry. This industry was a noted, if not key, civic value in the Hellenistic decrees. Such voluble honorific recognition ceded, largely, in the Roman period to pithier statements of honor recorded on statue bases. And the civic virtues extolled in the Hellenistic period were whittled down and presented amid a slightly different semantic range, one that emphasized the euergetic aspects of the honorand. A benefactor or hometown hero presumably possessed Philoponos characteristics. We hear about them in only 3 non-epitaphic or onomastic settings in all of imperial Greek inscriptions. Of these, 2 of the usages are for athletes, sponsored by the Athletes' Synod. I suggest these instances indicate the indissoluble aspect of athleticism in the self-fashioning of the Greek elite, one that is often short-shrifted in comparison to the allure of paideia. Successful Greek athletes tended to be elite youths, or at the very least broadly middle class, whose corporatizing into guilds allowed members to receive special perks of the kinds proffered to lettered laborers. I'll close with one example. So Aphrodisias in Caria produced a very successful pancratiast called Callicrates, who was forced into early retirement in the 2nd century due to his busted shoulders. His brief biography highlighted the fact that he, quote, obtained by sweat and labor his glorious reputation and came to be admired by all men throughout the inhabited world for the complete wisdom which he obtained through his love of labor. Intense physical training and toil for Callicrates resulted not only in professional success, prestige, and universal admiration, but wisdom as well. Callicrates' successful uniting of bodily toil and mental fruition indicate the continuity of Philoponia as a value from the Hellenistic period and the role of professional organizations, such as the Athletic Synod, that sponsored the decree in promoting such civic values. So Louis Robert noticed and commented on the similarities between the decrees for the other athlete that I mentioned, one Marcus Elphidius of Elea, the port town of Pergamon. Noticed similarities between this and consolation decrees issued by cities upon the premature death of promising young aristocrats. In the absence of tangible achievements, it is the potential achievements, as indicated by the deceased's nascent industry and diligence, that were worthy of civic approbation. The secret sauce, then, of Marcus Elphidius's Philopoeia and natural skill, then, was the money his parents were presumably able to spend on expensive training. This line of work, like paideia, was removed from the realm of possibility for the masses. The invocation of industry did not refer to a universal capacity to work, but to an individualized marker of superiority, one built on exclusion. Moving forward, I see philotomia and associated words as probably more promising lines of inquiry to look for the broader participation of the associations of workers, if not as figures looking to integrate into the elite value system, then at least parties interested in diversifying their toolkit of ways to advance the interests of their members. So just to wrap everything up, for my last presentation in the series, I spoke about this media plebs comprising a lettered workforce. So to close today, I want to return to that topos. I'd suggest along the lines of Claire Holloran's incisive remark yesterday about the question of voluntary mobility for junior contingent scholars, that there are some areas of overlap, even if superficial as of now, between the lettered workforce and their elite counterparts, and between contingent faculty members and tenured faculty. Similar work, similar expectations, but without the prestige, benefits, or room for advancement. Performing work that required training, literacy, and yet still was remunerated renders these workers lesser than in the eyes of certain elite authors, as is well established by now. So as one of the contingent members of this very impressive group of speakers, I just want to remind, again, the speakers and the broader audience to stay aware of their positions within the immediate and larger power structures of the university environs. Our individual research agendas can easily subsume our bandwidths of energy, but solidarity lies beyond those agendas. An all too brief Google search, for instance, reveals that every institution represented here among the panelists and speakers, with perhaps one exception, has been a locus of strike, of wage dispute, of workplace safety concerns among employees, not just faculty, within the larger university over the past 2 decades. We're presently elucidating the status of work and workers over time. Part of that inquiry must, I think, include a sustained look at how everyone is treated in the institutions that sustain our work. So with that, I will open it up for discussion, and thank you for your time.